The following interview with pioneering educator author Marcia Sinatar features her new autobiography, Joyful in the Silence, The Making of a Casual American Contemplative. I'm your host, Fred Anderley. Few professionals have the breadth and depth of practical experience with so diverse a constituency. From the start of Marcia's working life as a primary school teacher, she advanced through the ranks of public sector administration, then founded her solo leadership practice. For nearly 50 years, she has immersed herself in the study and guidance of the wholesome upper reaches of creative and spiritual expression. Her approach is universal, beyond divisions of age and type of learner. As one client put it, Marcia is unusually relatable, like a favorite family member with whom one feels safe and understood. From the 1980s through today, the author of nearly 30 books, Marcia Sinatar has received ongoing awards from a variety of publishing groups, such as Body, Mind, Spirit Magazine Award of Excellence, the Athena Award for Mentoring and Publishing Excellence, and just last year, the Folio Digital Magazine Award for Article Excellence. Please join us now as Marcia describes a little of her personal journey in what's been called her trademark lucid and gentle voice. Marcia Sinatar, welcome.
Oh, thank you, Fred. It's so good to talk to you in this way. And before we get launched here, I want to congratulate you on this new collection of poetry, Every Instant Offering Grace. It's honestly, Fred, it's beautiful.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much, Marcia.
I want to get that in there, so.
All right.
Okay.
Joyful in the silence, silence with a capital S. You talk about a silence, you write, ever infused with joy. Tell me about that. I'd love to know about that kind of a silence.
Well, that kind of silence for me is contemplative, which we can talk about in a minute, and it's really God. Some people will call it the higher self. I wouldn't. I'd call it the highest self, the absolute, as opposed to the relative. It's really a state of being when one is transported, I would say, from the material realm, the five senses, the worries of the day, into a kind of transcendent state. And I think you allude to it in one of your poems, where you say gardening. She left herself. If I haven't gotten that right, you can correct me. But we leave ourselves in a material sense. That's sort of what I mean.
That sounds wonderful. And you experienced this, I guess we could say, presence of God, could we, at a very young age?
I did. I was, I don't know how old I was, but I had a wonderful grandmother who encouraged the spiritual side of my life before I was 5. Certainly by 3, I was praying. I can remember it. And although I don't pray in that way anymore, which was childlike, maybe childish, it still goes on. It's a state of being, a relationship, I would say. I would call it a relationship with God.
And it's you feel this. This is...
Yes, it's experiential. I do feel it. And I know I'm not the only one, because if I look at the great spiritual literature of all the world, you see this mystical thread, this transcendent acknowledgement of experience, wherein one is transported out of self, small s, ego, material, the five senses, my body pain, my worry, etc., into another dimension. The spiritual literature will call this very often the fourth dimension, which encompasses that silence that we're talking about, the transcendent.
Mm-hmm. Well, this is a good point, perhaps, to ask about the word contemplative. Again, your autobiography, right. Joyful in the Silence, The Making of a Casual American Contemplative. What does it mean to be a contemplative?
Well, I would liken it in 3 ways, 3 distinct ways that merge in the true contemplative. So the first is just a ordinary dictionary definition that everybody understands. It's to be pensive, pondering, thoughtful, to be in deep thought. So that's the first attitude, shall we say. I've called it a posture of heart, where the scientist, the poet, the inventor, the housewife who's changing a diaper with full concentration and marvel at the baby, it's something like that. They're thinking. So that's one level. Another level would be the prayer, the contemplative prayer, which is a special kind of prayer, and we can talk about that when you wish. And the third is a complete lifestyle. I don't even like the word lifestyle because it hints at a fashion. This is not a fashion. It's the whole life turned towards God or the absolute or the transcendent, the mystical, spiritual, whatever word you would put to it. It's that whole life, but it's a whole life of prayer. That turning is a prayer. So that's contemplative, and that's the way I experience life.
Yes.
And the monastic person, the cloistered person, all over the world, the same, but more so, even more so.
So if that's the contemplative life, which sounds marvelous, what is a casual American contemplative, those two adjectives?
Yeah, well, I would go to the word casual first. It just means relaxed. It means not. It does not mean indifferent or lackluster, but it is relaxed. It's a very. There's no. And by the way, the Desert Fathers of the 3rd century were, in my mind, casual. They weren't indifferent, but they also didn't have a systematic formula. Their prayer was not a formula. It was not a. There was no dogma. So for them, giving to the neighbor was as much a prayer as sitting down for 10 minutes or 20 minutes or an hour or whatever. So that's number one about casual. The second part, I think, has to do with the lifestyle itself, and I'm not sure if you want to get into that or not.
Well, let me ask you, you pray differently. The kind of prayer you're talking about as a contemplative is not the kind I would think of. We ask God for a favor or for a certain course of action. It's something different than that, huh?
It is something different than that, and it doesn't exclude that. It is, let's put it this way, let's start in terms of degrees of relationship with God. So the first degree would be what I would consider my own childlike experience, where you're basically praying to a Father above, very much above. Then we're coming to a place in adulthood where our attitude is more mature, and yet there are needs that we have, needs for money, needs for health, needs for protection for ourselves, family, like that. And that's perfectly right. Ask and you shall receive is sort of the watchword there. But then there's that contemplative prayer where one is not so much asking, and not so much even intending for a certain outcome, but actually being raised up. The literature has this expression that the contemplative way of prayer is not so much taught, but it's caught. In other words, and I don't say this is just for monastics. I say this is also for the poet, like yourself. Who taught you to be a poet? Nobody, I would imagine. Is that right?
That's right. That's correct.
Okay. How did you get that?
It arrived with a little practice, I would guess.
Exactly. It arrived as maybe a prompt. Maybe I can do this or that.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe I can say this or that. Oh, this beautiful forest. Maybe I can write about it. I certainly can't speak it in my normal speech. Then you sit down and you practice and you hone the talent that's inborn. came with thread. And that's the way it is for me. And one other little caveat, the reason I call it an American contemplative is that I'm not from this country by birth. And the thing I wanted most of all when I was a young girl, very young, was to be American. My dad was born in New York, talked about America, the promised land for us. And there was nothing more that I wanted than to be American. And so when I came here, although I had an accent, I worked hard and I got rid of it fast in order to sound American. And so that's why we have that adjective.
Your early years were spent in Shanghai, yes?
That's right. My dad was a businessman in Asia. Met my mother, who had been given a gift for her birthday by her parents. My mother was born in Egypt, and she had a sister in, I think at the time it was Japan. My dad was in Kyoto, and that's where my mother and father met and married, and then they moved to Shanghai before the war, World War II.
It's interesting. You say, you write, your mother never mentioned God. You write, beauty seemed her gateway to spirituality. Your father had another approach to spirituality. When you asked him about God, he sort of said, well, that's something that you need to experience. You need to find that out for yourself.
Yes, to my father, first, he was a very philosophical, integrous man, one of the more integrity-filled individuals I've ever met. And he believed and spoke to me about his place in my life being too important to sway me on something like God, and that was my job, and that I should come to my own understanding and faith, which many people will criticize. They'll say, well, you should have had spiritual formation. But look what happened. So with the influence of my paternal grandmother, who I've spoken about, there was no problem. I mean, I did not wander into a life of sin and lust, although I had my moments, I will say. As to my mother, it leads me to something else. Yes, my mother's entree into spirituality was beauty of every sort. She was very refined. I would call it delicate of sensibility, and she knew instantly, just viscerally, what was common and vulgar and what was refined and beautiful. And she loved beauty of every kind, which makes me want to say that my spirituality, and I think many people, embraces not just beauty, but many types of beauty as being a doorway to the divine. Beauty of word and speech and conduct and compassion, beauty of architecture and dance and music. You see where I'm going.
Mm-hmm.
God is infinitely varied, and expresses through us, through our talent, through our will, through our discipline, our heart, our minds. He expresses in infinitely beautiful ways, truthful ways. So this is the way I see it. And when I watch a ballet or a neighbor doing something unusually kind,
or it could be a mechanic working on a car, let's say.
A mechanic working on a car. I have a UPS driver that is just outstanding. And when he delivers a heavy package down, I have a long, steep driveway. He brings it down. Sometimes he drives down with tremendous skill. Sometimes he walks it down. I see God. I honestly, now I don't, I mean, you know what I'm saying. It's not starting to get all pious, but something in me is just grateful in a spiritual sense, in a practical sense too, I must say. because I'd never get it down the hill.
You mentioned you see God in various situations. Now, at a very young age, you had a vision of an angelic presence at the foot of your bed, and it was very interesting. I'd like you to tell us about that, and also your mother's reaction to that, and your grandmother's reaction, your paternal grandmother, which was a very, very different reaction.
Very different. My mother, who was very creative and had, I would call it mystical, second sight, they call it, where you know the future. My mother had that and was punished for it. In other words, she grew up in a very religious Catholic convent, and I guess her creativity and her zest for life, a kind of unorthodox streak, must have gotten her punished, is what I think. But anyway, when I spoke of that seeing or sighting of an angel, and I did see it, I was about 4, on my bedstand there, bedside. I was told, maybe, you didn't see that. It's just a dream. Don't talk
May I
about
ask,
that.
Marcia, may I ask, what did it look like to you? Do you remember? I mean, was it a physical presence?
It was a physical presence. And it seemed to be, and back to your question about paternal grandmother. My grandmother's name was Mimère, is what we called her, Mimère. She said, she related it to scripture, and indicated that this was my guardian angel, and that guardian angel would be with me always, and that in my heart God was already present and had me under his hand. In other words, your life would be under his hand. And that was sort of sometimes children get a prophetic word from their family. Sometimes a child will be told, you're no good, you're a blunderer, you're clumsy, you're stupid, you're bright, you're brilliant, you're beautiful, these things. Well, the prophetic word for me was religious, spiritual, and protective. And I've always felt, no matter what, no matter if a tree fell on me tomorrow, I've always felt and will feel through eternity God's hand, God's presence. I feel very thankful, fortunate. How fortunate. And what did I do to deserve this? You might ask or wonder, or someone will. I think it was something my ancestors must have done. Somebody somewhere is praying for me, was praying for me, and that angel was assigned. I don't know how to express it, and I think it's a remnant of childhood that I'm speaking this way. Very frankly to you, because this is going to go maybe up on YouTube, and God only knows what reaction I'll get.
Your mother, on the other hand, your grandmother was very supportive. Your mother said, "Oh, you had a dream, that angelic
right.
presence, just a dream."
That's right. My mother, I think, was afraid for me to get into this kind of thing. She didn't want me to get there. She didn't get there anymore because I think, as I said, she had been reprimanded, but my grandmother and would even at the, let's say, irritation of my dad, her son, take me when we were in Asia to different temples, and she loved all kinds. She reminded me in a way, or he reminds me, Billy Graham. I once heard on Larry King Live, and I cited it in one of my books, where he says to Larry King that when he goes to any church of worship, and he meant all over the world, he can, in most of them, not all, most, sense God's presence. And I think my grandmother was like that, and so she would take me all these different places of worship. Sometimes we would go in, and sometimes we would just stand around outside and talk to the people. She was like that. And this is when I was very little. So, it's an influence, Fred. It's an influence that has served me well through my life with, as you put it before, a variety of other people. I mean, I don't know anybody who has worked with the variety of people that I have.
I want to, Marcia, I want to ask you about horses because you see, until your teens, quote, it was God, books, and horses for you.
Yeah,
Something
yeah.
about riding a horse. Tell us about that.
Well, I would call it a champion rider, English saddle. Started at a very young age, again in China, before we left, and I would ride a full-size horse, not a pony, although I preferred a pony. For a long time, I did. They were just more my size, you know. Um, and when we lived in Thailand, which was later, I was older, I went to riding school every day after regular school, and there was what's called gymkhana work, and we entered into the riding school entered us into gymkhana competitions basically, and I was able to win some of those, but of course after we left the Asian experience, I'll put it, that went away. So I just stopped riding.
Well,
And
I'm wondering, I've never understood horses very well, but you write about a telepathic rapport between rider and horse.
oh, definitely.
Wow.
Oh, definitely. It's not just between rider and horse. You mentioned mechanics before. I think there is a telepathic relationship between champion driver and car in NASCAR or something like that, or football player and the ball itself. Same with any kind of sports, and uh, the talented, the innately talented, where that person is called into that work. And I go back to my work as a whole, which you alluded to at the first, where I've looked at this vocational aspect of our life, where we are called into something. We aren't really taught it until later, when we have to perfect it. But there's that rapport between ourselves and the thing, whether it's parenting, UPS driving, football, being a pilot, Air Force, whatever. I just see that connection. I just see that some of us are meant, and you see it in the gifted child. You see it in the talented child, the musician, the little musician, 5 years old, the mathematician. I have a brother-in-law who's a scientist. He must have shown this at a very, very young age, where the parent stands back marveling and says, oh my gosh, what do we have here?
Yeah, one example of that, a friend of mine has a son who is now in his 40s, who is a world champion skydiver. He with
Yeah.
other skydivers forms words in the air, and she
Yeah.
told me when he was very young, he was jumping off things everywhere. They couldn't figure out all this jumping off objects, jumping off garage
Yeah.
roofs.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Okay, and this makes me want to say every occupation has its excellent talent, its superior talent, and I mourn for the day that we try to extinguish this in childhood by saying everybody is the same. Everybody is not the same. The Down syndrome child has his or her excellence, and the parent knows it and loves it. That's a talent. That's a gift, and we should develop it, encourage it. So I'm big on talent.
I wanted to say also, this wonderful joy in the silence and this contemplative life that you live. On the other hand, you were, well, when your father. Tell us the story of your father being arrested by the Japanese in China, and how you responded to those soldiers when they came to arrest him and take him away to a prison camp.
Yes, well, my dad was a prisoner of war during the occupation of China by the Japanese during World War II, and this is I was about 4, and the soldiers came with guns to the house, not just ours, to all of the American businessmen, mostly the men, and some women who were thought to have influence in the community, and not just Americans, the Allied forces. So they came to the house. They gathered everybody in the household together in the living room, and huddled with my dad, and it was obvious that he was going to be escorted to prison camp, which in those days and during that war, and I won't go into it, they were brutal, brutal. I didn't know that. I was only a child. But anyway, when I saw that they were going to take my dad away, I started to fight with them to protect him. And my mother, of course, whisked me aside and made me stop. She was afraid that they'd shoot me. But as I write, they only wanted to touch my hair because I had white blonde hair. And, of course, they'd not seen that before. Excuse me. So that's the story. And I would have to say, to your point about joy, I don't know that that was joy. I do think that I am a ferocious protector of certain people I love, children, in a corporate environment, my client, whoever is my client. The corporation is my client, but also the individuals in there. So I have that nature. I'm sorry to say, Fred, sometimes intimidation gets the better of me, and I'm silent. And this is something I don't regret it because it's the way I am. But hopefully, as I get older, I'm improving.
Well, it's very interesting. You talk about your life as, by the way, we're talking with Marcia Sinitar, author, educator. Her new autobiography is Joyful in the Silence, The Making of a Casual American Contemplative. You talked about at a young age you felt you were living a predestinated life, What did that mean to you?
Well, it's we've talked a little bit about it before. I felt there was a certain kind of life for me. I didn't know at the time, and frankly, Fred, I didn't know until I was in my 20s what that might be. But I did know from looking around at the women and the men in my life, my relatives, friends of the family, that there was a certain kind of woman that I wanted to live like. I wanted to be like. Friends of my mom who were creative, single, childless, engaged, very much engaged in what they did. And I noticed that when they were around, or when I was around them, there was a freedom that they had that I didn't see in many other women. My mother specifically. And by the way, I was programmed, as most of us are, from youth to be married and a mother and a householder and a demure, obedient, polite wife. So here we have it. You sense this. One senses a life. I think that's predestination of a sort. And, of course, there's the whole religious overlay under which I operated.
Well, I suppose in a certain sense we all have a predestinated life. Is that right?
I think so.
Yeah.
I do think so.
Yeah.
I think the challenge is, in the Bible we read, many are called, but few answer. I think the issue for most of us is to come into our own as authentic individuals, full individuals. In the case of most people, this is a tremendous challenge, and very, very often, we stay unconscious to it. But William Blake, the poet, I admire him so much, and he says in one famous quote that to see the world in a grain of sand, to see the universe in a grain of sand. This is a kind of perceptual attitude that the contemplative has, the inventor, the mathematician. You talked about the skydiver. People who engage in extreme sports tend to have this perceptual field. How do they get there? They're jumping off roofs when they're little, or going swimming in the swimming pool before they know how to swim. So it is something that I think many people feel, but maybe they don't follow it.
Much earlier in your life in Los Angeles, you were a teacher and a principal, and
Yes.
amazingly inventive programs for the children in your school. And it seems to me, in looking over your more than 50-year life, that you are, if I had one word to sum you up, maybe is teacher a good word?
Teachers is the word. I think I'm an encourager of talent. I really love the teaching process. I've always loved it, and going back to the calling, when I was small, the adults in the household, with the exception of my dad, would come, to me, and we would discuss weighty subjects, and I could tell that they were listening. So this is an encouragement. But until my 20s, I didn't really realize that I wanted to be a teacher, an educator. I mean, I think there's another level to teaching. That is, you're not teaching reading, writing, and math. I call it true learning. You're really bringing people up into the awareness of who they are as human beings. So there's that piece of it. But I think there's always been that desire to contribute to people's growth in that way.
Mm-hmm. You still do dialogue sessions, do you not, with individuals?
I do. Now this I do remotely, and the dialogue sessions, and I would have to say it's a tremendous gift to me that people would still want to chat with me. The dialogue session is more or less a sounding board, and the mentoring, feedback on a whole range of topics, and I prefer to work with people that at least know something about my work, my background, and it is a two-way dialogue. It's a two-way street. It's not just let's say they're talking to me and I'm giving them answers. Not at all. It's more or less a two-way street where we're looking together at something, an issue, a mindset, a relational problem, a leadership aspect. It's mostly in the area of leadership.
Mm-hmm. You write at one point that you have a DNA for solitude, but you also write that you love people and you love to be out there with them. You love to be doing the kind of work we're talking about in the dialogues and the teaching. Yes, both.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Kind of a little paradox, and I think many people will understand this. As you can tell, and as people can tell from just listening to the way I speak and my background, I'm not shy. I'm rather extroverted, really, but I'm a natural solitary. I love being alone. It pains me when the house is full of people. Dry rot. I have some dry rot repair going on, and I want to have a new stove, so there's going to be somebody coming in. I can't do my work if I'm distracted, and I distract myself on a regular basis. So one thing I've had to learn, for example, this morning, I cannot go to the computer first thing. I have to keep that off until after lunch. I usually divide my day into morning and afternoon, and lunch is a dividing part, the dividing line, where I would do the things that require reflection, writing or teleconferencing or whatever, early in the morning. And, of course, prayer, meditation, like that. And then in the afternoon, I leave myself alone, pretty much do what I want.
It's interesting that you say late in life now you can say, I'm quoting here, so this is why I was born,
Yes.
to do this work, this service, to be a contemplative. And We'd all like to be able to say that as we grow older, wouldn't we? That this is why I was born, and I've done it, and I'm doing it,
Yes,
whatever
yes,
it may be.
yes. I do feel that, and I have a friend who, I guess next week she's turning 90, and I think she feels that way. Now, let me describe her life briefly. She was a CEO of a company. She did that, and she's very, very talented in marketing and many other things, business. She did that to raise two sons alone, and she's an exemplary mother and grandmother, and soon to be, I'm sure, great grandmother. All right, so here is someone, and myself included, two totally different lives, following some instinct, some intuitive direction, and coming out at the end of the experience, this experience. I don't believe it's the final chapter. To say, as you just pointed out, this is why I was born. And I want to say one other thing, and I thought about this about a few months ago. It came to me that I have a feeling of great privilege, not in the material sense, although that too, but first and foremost, this deep, profound privilege of having this life, of having been given this life. And do you know, Fred, what makes it more and more obvious and experiential and profound is this giving, service. Not service in some sort of look at me, virtue signaling way, but little things. And of course, the ability in a dialogue session to give away what I've gained, what I've learned. It's like I think in Scripture somewhere in Corinthians it talks about being fruitful as an honoring of God. I do think that the more fruitful, the more we honor God, because the fruit doesn't come from ourselves. It's not of me, Marcia, the material, egocentric, driven person. It's like you put in your haiku. It's when I've left myself that the fruit comes. There's a mystical tree. I think it's Asian, Chinese, and it's probably I think it's metaphorical, but maybe it's real, where the roots grow up out of the ground up to heaven, and the fruit grows below ground. And it's called the mystical tree of China. Evelyn Underhill, the spiritual writer, talks about it. And that's, I think, what our life could be like, where the true person is reaching up all the time to the transcendent, and the fruit, therefore, is growing, bubbling up all the time from beneath, not from the tree itself, if that makes any sense.
Mm-hmm. So part of a God-centered life, in addition to contemplation or to a certain kind of prayer, is service to others, service to God by serving others. And we can all participate in doing that, I would assume.
Oh, we all do participate in. We do. We don't always acknowledge that we're doing it. The UPS driver I spoke about, the parent who forfeits their own talent, what they love to do in order to raise a child or more than one, they are serving. They're absolutely giving themselves away for the benefit of other people. Who knows how many FedEx and UPS drivers have back pains in order to give what they can do out of their strength and their goodwill to somebody else. Look at the NFL. Now, I know they make millions and millions. Don't write to me, people. But they're giving themselves away for our entertainment. Yes, they're getting a benefit. Why shouldn't they? But you see what I mean. Mm-hmm. Everybody is giving themselves away. Whether you like it or not, you're doing it in some way.
Now, you also write that, and this is a little surprising to me, but I understand it now, contemplatives, such as yourself, tend to be social, not isolates.
Oh, yeah. Oh, definitely. I mean, there's this saying in Scripture that prayer is a sacrifice. It is a sacrifice. So it's true that some contemplatives are isolates in a way that they don't really enjoy people. I don't think this is a true contemplative. In fact, Merton writes about the monastery, and he talks about the active livers. They're active in their nature, but they live in a contemplative fashion, who knows why, and they ruin it, the active livers ruin it for everybody else who's a true contemplative because they're more legalistic. So the true contemplative will love other people. I mean, that's the great commandment, to love others. So you can't love others if you hate their company.
You know, you also write, and I'm quoting you here, I wonder what we each might become without our various soul sicknesses. And it's a reference, your mother had a terrible decline into a severe mental illness.
Yes.
And of course, I look around in our community and around the world, and we see so many people afflicted with mental and physical illnesses.
Yeah.
By the way, we should say later your mother had a wonderful healing as well.
That's right.
Yeah, and but people suffer so much.
People do suffer, and I guess part of it, if I can look generally speaking, generically, it's, the expression, the world is too much with us. We forfeit ourselves, domineering parents, abusive. I trace it back to childhood, early childhood, and I think this is standard. Maybe there's something else, something chemical going on. Possible, I don't know.
Mm-hmm.
I have to tip my hat to Christian Science and the New Thought belief system, faith, tradition. My mother, thanks to her sister, with whom she lived later in life, had a tremendous healing by virtue of Christian Science, the practitioners that would come to the house. But not only Christian Science, other New Thought. Christian Science probably doesn't think of themselves as New Thought. But anyway, it just makes me want to say that it's not too late to come back to ourselves and to authenticate who we are and to start honoring who we are. As a matter of fact, outside of time and space, it is never too late to come back and honor who you are. I really do think that that's the job. As I said earlier, as an educator, I would say that's the true learning. And it could, barring chemical stuff, physical aspects that I know too little about and won't mention, but barring that, the abandoning of our own call, if you will, the summons to be real, the standing up for ourselves, and we're seeing a lot of this now. Many people don't like it. It flies in the face of tradition. I don't like some of it myself, but if generally and gradually it leads people to themselves to be honest and real and have a sense of their true being inside, highest self, deepest self, whatever you want to call it, okay.
Well, we're all going to suffer, I guess, and you have had terrible suffering in your life. Your father died at a very young age,
Yes.
48.
Yes.
And you said that was the end of childhood for you. Your mother was terribly afflicted with the mental illness,
Right.
and you've had some losses. Do you think that these losses is there any positive note to big losses like that?
Yes. First of all, to the losses, there has been, through my, I guess, late 20s, a series of losses, very severe, and that shadowed me, was a shadow under which I did live for a long time until I went to therapy, much needed, and little by little, some of that grief It was diagnosed delayed grief. Went away, did go away, has gone away, much of it. And still, to your question about the positive, I think it has enabled me to understand other people in a way that is unique to me, is unique to my vocation, and has allowed me the privilege, again, that's a privilege, of understanding a whole lot of people and speaking to them in a way that lets them accept who they are. That's a gift. It's a gift to me. It's a gift to them. I know it is because I honestly, Fred, when I'm talking to someone in these dialogue sessions, I hear them taking notes. They're either clacking away on that keyboard or I can hear the scratching of pencil on paper. They're taking notes in order. I think it was Milton Erickson. He would say, "My voice goes with you. My voice will go with you." I think it was him. And I do feel that way, that my voice will go with other people, which is why I wanted to make the YouTube archive so that my voice, I might have 3 people that visit it. But down the line, who needs it will find it. And I want to give that away.
Do you ever, you talk about at one point you, after your father died and your mother became ill, that you say you gave God the cold shoulder.
Yeah.
Do you ever doubt, you feel God's love, but do you ever doubt it?
I don't now. No, now I don't. In fact, more and more, as I've mentioned, the experience. I don't know what comes first, faith or experience. For me, I think experience, because I was so little when I began to want to pray. But yes, when I was 14, my dad died when I was 13. My mother went away at the same time. I don't think she ever said goodbye. She just left. And as I've mentioned in my autobiography, I was rooting for her because she was afraid. She was afraid that she was going to be locked up, and she eventually was put away, and that's literal, put away in a mental institute. And at the time, this would have been in the 50s, those were not pleasant places. How she avoided some of the more extreme therapies, I don't know. And as a matter of fact, I don't know if she did, because she never would speak about those things. So to your question about the cold shoulder, I was about 13, 14 at the time, and I was contending with God in a very similar way to Jacob, who did contend with God and the angel, and yet ended up being blessed. One night I remember praying to God and saying, "Look, you've taken my dad, the most honest man you could know, the kindest, most responsible parent a person could have, and my mother, a beautiful person, they're gone. My brother into the military. Here I am alone. So what good has all this prayer been?" That's the end of it. And I do think that when you have a relationship, it's intimate with the Lord, you can speak that way, and it's fine. Because you see in David, the psalmist, you see these heart-to-heart talks where he talks about being forlorn and beset with enemies and what am I going to do. He speaks very bluntly and frankly to God, and I think this is the way it is when you have that relationship.
And that relationship continues in your life.
It does continue.
In all of our lives, perhaps, whether we recognize that or not.
Yes, because it's your life. God is your life. Well, this means our very breath, heartbeat, the kingdom within. And as we turn today, tonight, here, now, why, that's prayer.
Marcia Sinitar's new autobiography is Joyful in the Silence, The Making of a Casual American Contemplative. Marcia, thanks for being with us today.
Oh, Fred, thank you for the types of questions, allowing me this rare opportunity to be frank, and I'm grateful. Thank you so much.
And we want to mention that Marcia Sinitar continues to develop leadership talent through her dialogue sessions, living and working at home, as she writes, as simply and quietly as possible. As one reader noted, she is the national treasure about whom too few of us know, giving her hidden way of life. For more information, visit marciasinitar.com, where you'll find a link to an archive of other talks and interviews. I'm your host, Fred Anderley. All rights are reserved worldwide, including electronic.